Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Another rendition of the B&H virtual event space. David Marx, photographer, educator, back joining us once again. Although this time we're not talking about taking photos, we're talking about the post-production end of things. So, David, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Always a pleasure to have you. And today we're keeping it simple. So we're going to be talking about some tips and tricks in Lightroom. So whether you're well-versed or not like me, I say this every time we do a our Lightroom workshop, by the way. I need to get on it. I need to finally switch over, make it happen, and get well-versed. So, David, I'm going to be paying attention along with all of our viewers. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to get them in, and David will help do his best to answer them. But, David, show is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the wonderful B&H folks for inviting me back again. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in to watch today. Today, I thought I'd talk about some travel photography tips. Now, this won't be a complete course on Lightroom. Obviously, it takes more than 50 minutes, an hour to learn. And to be clear, the word Lightroom now describes a category of products. I'm going to demo with the sort of traditional Adobe Photoshop Lightroom Classic version, meaning the one where the photos are stored on my computer, not the Adobe Lightroom version where the photos are stored on Adobe's clouds. Most of what I'll do today, though, could be done in either version, with one big exception, the stuff that I want to get to sort of in the second half of my presentation today. So first half, I thought I'd add some developing tips and tricks, stuff to make our photos look brighter, cleaner, better, because really that's the fun stuff of image processing. And not that it's not fun, but I thought I would end with some of the features of Lightroom Classic that are very helpful for organizing travel and landscape photography, which is what I love to do. So here, let me start up a screen share, and hopefully on the screen right now, I think I'll kill my webcam for a minute just to get better resolution. If you enjoyed today's talk, you can find me online in sort of 3 easy places. I have a website full of Lightroom and photography tutorials. That's focusphotoschool.com. This is me. You can find me, of course, on YouTube. The same, it's the Focus Photo School channel on YouTube. And when I teach live, when I teach workshops or private tutoring, Lightroom classes, these days I teach primarily for this company. One right here, I live in Montana. This is Glacier Photo Guides, and these are primarily where you'll find me. Okay, enough with the shameless self-promotion. So the topic for the day is travel photography tips in Lightroom. And like I said, I want to teach first some image enhancement, repair stuff, and then some organizing stuff. And so to get us started, the way I like to explain the image processing workflow in Lightroom is first we're going to repair the problems. And all of our photos have some problem, dust spots, something. We'll repair the problems. Will enhance the global image, meaning the white balance, the whole color of the image, the exposure, how bright, how dark. And then we'll move to more local stuff, the sky, not the buildings, or this area, not that area. So to get us started here, first of the problems that we might run into. And I've picked some images today where I've already done a little bit of work to tune them up for the screen. Hopefully they look decent. But one of the problems that we run into, and it's a little problem, I'm going to start with something small and easy to miss at first, are lenses. When light passes through the lens, the beam of light can scatter, and it can create these weird stripes, these unnatural bands of color. So I'm going to zoom way in here on the side of this cold, icy dock out in the lake where I live here in Montana. And if I zoom in enough, I hope you'll see that there's like a green stripe running down the left edge and a purple stripe running down the right edge of these pylons. You can probably see it down here in the reflection, where you won't see it on a nice lens. Basically anything that B&H sells these days, you shouldn't see any chromatic aberration smack in the middle, because the middle is the cleanest part of the lens. And likewise, the aberration is probably there. It's a flaw in the glass of the lens, but you're not going to see it in an area where we don't have any clean edges. You're only going to see it here where there ought to be a nice crisp edge. Well, this is, I have to admit, a Canon L lens, the highest end glass that Canon makes, but all lenses, no matter their price point, can have this flaw, this aberration flaw. Well, fortunately, Lightroom makes it really easy to clean that up. Now, it's not where you might think it would be, at the top in the basic panel. Basically, if you were following the develop module of Lightroom from the top down, you wouldn't find this control first. You'll find it instead down here in the lens correction panel. In the other type of Lightroom, you'll find the same control, but it's in the optics panel. Anyway, in here, there's this one simple switch, one that says remove chromatic aberration. So let me turn this guy on. And when I do, that stripe, that green and purple fringe, it ought to just vanish. And I have to sort of smile here. I'm going to split the screen and zoom back in so you can see the before and after. Oops, too fast. Weird fringing? No weird fringing on the after. I have to smile here because what Adobe has done for me is really create a better lens, a better image than I can actually afford. I got to say thank you, Adobe. This is a better photo than my camera actually captured, and it only took one button. Likewise, another flaw that we often have, we'll often have vignetting in our images. Now, vignetting is a tricky topic in photography because vignetting means the darkening of the corners around the sides of our rectangle. And often vignetting is very helpful. It's something we want. It can hold the viewer's attention in the center of the frame. So there are times when we want to add vignetting to our photos. There are times when we want to keep the vignetting that our lens might have created, but there are other times where we don't want it. And this to me is one of those examples where I really didn't want an image where all four corners are, I have to say, sort of unnaturally dark. Again, this is shot with a high-end lens, but this is just a problem with the optics. So if I go to this lens correction panel in Lightroom, first I'll turn on the remove chromatic aberration. It's probably super minor, but I'll show that there is indeed aberration here. There's some green and purple fringing. Now I got to get in there ridiculously close to see it, but it's there. Turning this on can do me no harm. But the bigger one, I'm going to turn on this enable profile correction, and it'll take it a second. But if you watch carefully, you'll see how the corners get brighter and the center, in fact, sort of the geometry of the image is somewhat more accurate. Before, it had kind of a bent, bowed look, and after, it'll be a little more geometrically precise. Now, this is being shot with a really wide lens, a 20 millimeter lens, and so this makes it a little better. Now, it's not as if there's some magic happening here. What's really going on is that the folks at Adobe took a Canon camera and they took this particular lens and they made a correction. They photographed a test chart to find out how much does it vignette and how much does it bend the world, that distortion. And if I was to click here, you'd see that they've tested a lot of Canon lenses. And if I clicked here, you'd see that they've done this for Nikon and Fuji and Olympus. Not every lens from every camera, but an awful lot of them. So the reason I'm starting here is I think this is one of these easy parts of Lightroom to understand and easy to ignore. But if we improve the optics of our lens by just turning on these two simple switches, we get better photos from the get-go. Okay, so to take this a little further, since this is about travel, and to me, travel means buildings, beautiful places, that sort of thing. In this photo, I'm photographing the inside of a gorgeous hotel lobby. This is in Nashville, Tennessee, a beautiful Union Station old train hotel. And in this case, I'm going to show that there is indeed that chromatic aberration. Now, I've picked photos where I can show this to you, but once you found it once, if you make note of what lens you were using, truth is, if you look hard enough, you'll find it again and again. It's a property of that lens. So I'm going to get rid of that aberration. Likewise, I'm going to enable the profile correction to do that sort of geometric repair. But the problem here is I didn't bring the right gear to this photo shoot. I'm not a professional architecture photographer. A professional architecture photographer would have brought a tilt shift lens or a camera where they could adjust the film plane to keep these columns, these lines, nice and vertically straight. And if you notice in my photo, these guys are really pulling out to the side. They're not correct in their sort of vertical tilt. So to fix that, I'm going to slide down to another panel in Lightroom called Transform. And for folks who shoot buildings, architecture, again, not the professionals, but I'd call them hacks, folks like me, sloppy, walking around the city with just a regular old 20-something millimeter lens, this is pretty amazing. What I'm going to ask Lightroom to do is to look at this photo and to try and make it more geometrically accurate. And so I could move these controls myself. I'll do that in a second. But for now, let's just let Lightroom study the image. I'll hit the auto button. And what it should do is it should straighten those columns out. Let me turn this on and off once or twice. You can see the before and after. Before, the building, the walls are kind of peeling out to the right and left. After, they should be much more accurate, much straighter. Now, I have to say this is amazing. And again, I'm really grateful to Adobe for making a better photo than I actually captured. However, it comes at a price. And the price are these white rectangles or triangles now in the top corners. What Lightroom had to do to straighten the building out is it had to skew this image. It had to pinch it and bend it in. And so right now, this image is no longer rectangular. It's got what, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's got a bunch of sides. It's not a rectangle. Each one of these is a separate side. So along with straightening, I have to crop if I want this to fill a rectangle. So I'm going to hit this constrained crop, and that tells Lightroom to cut away all that extra white space. Now, I just want to show that although this is amazing, and I'm going to demo this a couple more times, it does come at a price. If I go back to the full image, the stuff here that's kind of hidden away, this is the stuff that Lightroom has cropped away. You see this chair in the bottom left corner? Let me just reset that crop a second. If there was something important going on down here in this corner or in this corner, if I have to skew the image to straighten it up, well, then I'm going to lose that piece of my photo. So I don't want you to hear this as an excuse for being a sloppy photographer, but I do want to say as an architecture, travel, landscape kind of guy, this is really, really useful to me. And I use this again and again. Here we'll jump from Tennessee to Las Vegas. Same problem here from this angle with the wide angle lens that I love to use. The buildings of Vegas they're not kind of straight and square. So to fix that, first I'll do the lens correction stuff again, and that'll make a little bit of difference, kind of push things out to the side. And then I'll go to this transform. Now, last time I just pressed auto, and it worked really well. And I could press auto or level or vertical. Each of these is a different way that it studies the photo for me. But it doesn't always get it right. So instead, that's what these controls down here let us do. So I'm going to take, for example, the vertical tilt, and I'll just straighten those up myself by pivoting it about like this. Maybe I'll rotate the horizon just a little, make it a little more level, something like that. And I might just change the aspect ratio, make it a little wider. Again, I'm afraid I have to crop it to make it a square. But now I think I have a much more accurate photo than what I started with. Let me show you a before, kind of falling over, after. Okay. And I do this, of course, obviously with a lot of my city travels, but I also do this a little with my landscapes. Here, we'll hop to North Cascades National Park. When I'm photographing mountains and trees, stuff like this, stuff like I have here in Montana where I live, I want my mountains to appear really, really tall. So even in a scene like this, where I don't think we sense that things are falling over, I might take that vertical control and transform it just a little, maybe 5 or 10. The numbers here, they don't really interest me. I'm more interested in the visual effect. Does the mountain feel like it's falling back in space? And here the mountain is a bit taller. Again, something has to be cropped away, but now I have that much taller feeling mountain than I would have had originally. Well, I love what's going on here, but I don't want to tell you again that this is without a price. If you photograph something like this, and for some reason, lighthouses are kind of a theme for me. Although I live in a landlocked state, I love teaching and photographing out at the coast of Maine, coast of Oregon, coast of California. And for some reason, I find that just lighthouses really fit the travel photography style that I'm into. So here, I have sort of the same problem. That lighthouse seems to be falling over. Well, if I ask Lightroom to make it vertically accurate for me, it does this. And you can see the lighthouse now sort of falls out of the top of the frame. Let me undo that. Let me try and do it myself. So I can pivot it a little bit and it stays in the frame. But to really get it the way I think it should be, like that, no dice. I didn't have enough room at the top for this kind of transformation. So although I think this is really a wonderful tool, I don't think it's any excuse for sloppy photography. Okay, well, most of that stuff I would cover in any class, but there's one more Lightroom feature, particularly for those who photograph buildings or artwork, that I think is in here and can be really, really helpful. I don't think this one works real well for, say, pure landscapes, trees and mountains, but something like this. This is a old one-room schoolhouse out on the prairie in Kansas, and I was out there photographing once late at night under a full moon. When you're photographing this kind of thing, I think it can be really helpful to have the building stand up nice and straight. The problem here is that, again, I'm using this super wide lens, a 20mm lens, and I'm down low and sort of tilted to the building. So it really feels like it's peeling back in visual space. Now, I could try any of these controls. I could, of course, move any of these sliders, but there's this one bonus when we sort of have this, can I say, head-on angle to a building. And that's what they call the guided upright tool. If I activate this one, what I get is a little crosshair and a loop, an enlargement of what's underneath the cross. It's the big white and black cross that really matters here. Well, what I can do is I can drag out a guideline for Lightroom along the edge of that building. And by using the loop, I can see that I position it fairly accurately with the actual line on the side of the building. One line isn't going to do anything for you. It's when you drag out your second line that Lightroom can then compare one to the other, and it will snap the photo so that the two lines become vertically accurate. Now, as you can see, that means cropping off a ton of this image. So when I hit the constrain crop button, most of my subject no longer fits in the frame. And that's where these two sliders, the X and Y offset, come into play, because it's with these that I can push the crop up or down to tell Lightroom, no, what I really want to include is down there at the bottom. And as I move this, it has to crop in more and more and more, but eventually we should get to a nice straight building, and, you know, as opposed to the one that's falling over. Cool. Okay, so let's say at this point that we've repaired all the little stuff, the geometry, the lens problems. I skipped dust spot removal, but I would do that sort of stuff first as well. So now let's move to like the next phase, what I call the global repairs for our images. And here I'm talking about the big picture stuff, the stuff that is all over the image from one end to the other, you know, not the little stuff, but the big picture. And one of the first places that we'll see something wrong from end to end in a photo is if the color isn't accurate. Now, color is what they refer to as white balance in Lightroom or in the digital photography world. And basically, white balance means the mix of blue light and yellow light, or green light and purple light, magenta light, that gives us an accurate rendition, not just of white, but of white, gray, black, and all the colors in the rainbow in between. So here, I was out photographing at twilight at this beautiful lighthouse that I love on the coast of Maine. And for some reason, I set my camera not to the auto white balance setting, where I usually would leave it, but to another setting. I set it wrong, to be honest. And so what happened when I set that wrong instruction in camera is it made the world this underwater, unnatural blue. It doesn't look right. So I've got to fix that. Now, in Lightroom Classic, there are a number of tools here in the white balance section at the top of the basic panel that I can use for that kind of repair. First option, since this is a raw file from a digital camera, I could just let Lightroom set it to auto white balance and see what it thinks the color ought to look like. And in this case, Lightroom, I think, did pretty darn well. Now, along with auto, I could try and match it to the type of light that it was photographed under. So for example, this would be under broad daylight. This would be like a cloudy day. Cloudy is a little warmer than daylight because, of course, cloud cover adds some blue to our world. Shade and tungsten and on down the list. In fact, if I pick the tungsten setting, what we'll find is that it looks a lot like what I actually photographed. In fact, this is where I went wrong in the camera. I don't claim to be a very bright person. For some reason on this particular evening, I guess I believed that a giant tungsten halogen light bulb is what illuminates the world because that's what I told my camera the type of light would be. Well, that's completely wrong. So let's go back to say cloudy, or let's try shade. Yeah, one of these feels better to me. Now, if none of these presets are getting me exactly what I want, then I'm free to mess with these sliders myself. If I pull the temperature to the left, I'm going to add blue and cool things down. We'll get a more twilight feel. If I go the other way, as I push the slider to the right, I'm going to add yellow and we'll get a warmer, more daylight feel. Well, in this case, I think a little more on the twilight side is probably more accurate. But what I hope you're seeing here is that this is changing the entire image from one corner to the other. The complete mix of light is what we're adjusting. And if I get it right, I go from something like this, way too blue, underwater and weird, to something like this, much more accurate. Well, I actually find, sometimes I set the camera wrong. That's my fault. But sometimes even when the camera is in auto, it gets it wrong. In this case, it got it wrong in a pleasing way. This is beautiful Acadia National Park. I tried to pick some fall foliage images, given that it's mid-October here. I don't think the camera did a bad job, but the camera didn't do a great job either. It made this photo, I think, a little too warm yellow or too kind of greenish. That these are that white paper birch tree. And here they have kind of a green color cast or a yellow color cast to them. So I need to fix this. Now, again, I could just go auto, and that looks better. I could go daylight. I could pick any of these on the list. And I think these all give me a decent starting point. But I'm going to kind of fine tune myself. Now, since you probably weren't in this scene, I think the thing to do when color correcting is to look at something that you have a memory of. What color should a birch tree be, or a sidewalk? Something, it's real hard to color correct if we're staring at, the green grass. How green is it? Who knows? Or the red autumn leaves. But that tree is a pretty memorable kind of color for me. So I'm going to adjust the blue and yellow myself. I think I'll make this even a little colder. Let's see. I'll go too cold, too far on the blue. Warm it up a little. I think about there. Now the tint slider, the green purple, it moves really, really fast. The temperature you can kind of cruise along and it's pretty good. But on this one, I tend to move in very small increments, if at all. So I'm going to just adjust these two a little bit like this. And now if I split the screen to show you a before and after, I hope you'll say that the one on the right, my after, is more accurate. Now, you may like warm yellow. I find the warmth of this one very pleasing, but that excess of yellow light, it kind of messes up the colors of the wooden walkway. This seems a very warm wood color, and it's going to take some of the nuance out of all these red leaves. They're going to become more orange leaves because that's what the excess of yellow light will do for us. Okay, so white balance, one of the first things I'll fix in my landscape and travel photos. Next, we got to talk about exposure. And for this, I think we got to look at the histogram. Now, we get histograms in our camera when we're shooting, and we get histograms in Lightroom or most photography programs when we're editing. The idea here is the histogram represents the distribution of possible tones from inky black on the far left all the way over to paper white. So if you can imagine it, think of this as being the blackest black. This is medium gray along the x-axis, and this is paper white. Now, the vertical axis is how many pixels you have in this image at each of those different shades of brightness. And for our first example, I made this a black and white because I think it's easiest to see it if we're thinking in black and white. If I grab this exposure control in Lightroom and I pull it up, I can make the whole photo brighter, and the histogram moves towards paper white. If I pull this guy down, I make the whole photo darker, and the histogram, of course, moves to the left towards inky black. Well, I don't want to move the whole histogram. What I want to do is spread out what I have. I want to distribute the shades of gray that I captured so they fill up the range of tones. Basically, I want to stretch things out so that I have something down by inky black and so that I have something up near paper white. And if I adjust these a little bit, I'll season the in-betweens here. What we ought to get is something like this. Now, when I show you the before and after here, I'm going to split the screen again. The one on the left, which is the before, I bet it feels very flat, very murky, very muted. It doesn't even feel perhaps very three-dimensional. The one on the left, the after, will feel sharper, higher contrast. And that's because I'm using that whole tonal range. Well, I bet you're saying this is fine, Dave, but what does this have to do with travel photography? Well, it has to do everything with it because most of the time we're working in color, but the same skeleton that our exposure creates, the same superstructure for our colors to hang on is there in every image. So let me just show you real quick. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the full color photo. I'll drag the blacks down. I'll drag the whites up. I'll adjust these in-betweens. And in no time, I go from a very sort of muted, murky, kind of flat, grayish green image to one that's much more three-dimensional, one that has a lot more vibrance, a lot more saturation, maybe even more sharpness. But I haven't touched any of those controls. All I've done is fill up the range of usable tones. And this comes to benefit us in all sorts of places. For example, here, I may love the foggy feel, but this photo feels very muted. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag the blacks down, the whites up. And as I move these, this is where the histogram is so helpful. I'm trying to keep it within the range of usable tones. Maybe I'll adjust my in-betweens. And in no time, whoops, too much. In no time, I go from this foggy and flat to foggy and full of color. Or here, same idea. In my original image this time, I've done a better job exposing. I don't have anything blown out, nothing paper white. I do have some tiny little black pixels, but what I really need to do here is to spread out what I have. I'll make this brighter. I'll fill in the light with the shadows, and I'll lower the brightness of my brightest pixels with the highlights control. And if I adjust this a little bit, let's just adjust this way. When I show you the before and after here, watch this area right in here. Let me slide this over. Watch how much more light, more interest there is in the after in this part of the photo. Here, it looks like it's inky black. In fact, most of the detail in the harbor is missing. But after I adjust that tonal range, so much more interest, so much more visible detail in this kind of photo. I'll show you one more of this. This is downtown Seattle. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I feel like I did a good job with exposure when I shot this photo. I didn't let the sky blow out. We can see here at the far right edge of the histogram, it's almost paper white, but not quite. Well, since it's almost paper white, I don't have to move this slider very far. Since there's already some strong blacks in there, I don't have to move this one very far either. But what I really need to do is to fill in that detail in the darker, not darkest, but darker pixels using the shadows. and lower the highlights to bring back some of that cloud. And if I adjust these guys a little bit, we'll go from this, where my foreground is lacking detail, to this, where downtown, the Seattle area has lots of detail to see. Okay, well, that's what I mean by global repairs. There's one more that I think really can benefit travel photographers, and that's control, once we've already set the white balance and the exposure, over the strength of color in our photo. Now, the strength of color, it has a bunch of different sliders in the Lightroom kingdom. There's a slider called saturation. And what saturation does is it bumps up the strength of all the colors in the rainbow. It doesn't turn the colors from red to blue or yellow to something else. It just takes them from pastel up to ridiculous neon, up to like nuclear melted Crayola crayons. Too much. So the saturation control, if used gently, it can be really helpful. But the problem with the saturation control, I shouldn't say the problem, but the lack of nuance here is that it does the whole rainbow all together. And if we add saturation to all of the colors, it doesn't tell the viewer's eye which parts of this photo I wanted you to focus on. So check this out. I'm going to reset the saturation back down to where it was. And instead of working in the basic panel, I'm going to go down to the HSL panel, the hue, saturation, and luminance panel in Lightroom. And the reason I'm going to do that is that in the saturation area, I now get separate sliders for our different reds and oranges and greens. We get 8 different controls. So now I can say, I want my reds and my magentas, that's the color of these flowers, to be really strong. And I want my yellows and greens not as strong. Maybe I'll bring down the blues and the aquas. Now, I'm not trying to make this like a weird black and white photo. I'm just trying to add emphasis to some colors and subtract it from others. So if I ask you right now, where does your eye go in this photo? I bet you're going to say my eye goes right to those red flowers. Maybe the red of the flag would be the next thing you notice. Well, remember that. Remember you said the reds were the most eye-catching. Because if I double click here and reset this, and now if I tune this the opposite way, let me fade the red and magenta down. Let me fade the orange and green down a little. Let me bump up the blue. This time, I can drive your attention, I bet, not to the flowers, but back here to the sky. And this is why I think for us travel photographers, fine-tuning the colors individually is so powerful. In this setup, your eye is drawn to the back of the frame. And in this setup, where I was just a second ago, give me a second here. If I compare the two side by side, in this setup, your vision was railroaded right to the front of the frame. It's the same photo, but depending on how I choose to use those saturation controls, I can hold your attention at the front, or I can drive your attention right past it to the back. Well, that's powerful, powerful stuff. And that leads us then to the smaller stuff that we can do in Lightroom. Let's say in this case that we want to change just the sky and not the whole image. Well, the way we would do this traditionally in photography, if we wanted to darken a sky, is with a graduated filter, a colored piece of glass that's darker at the top than it is at the bottom, something like this. And B&H sells a whole, you could spend a fortune on beautiful, useful graduated filters and filter holders. And I have some and I use them and I love them. But Lightroom has something similar, not as a replacement, but as an addition to. In this case, I'm in the Alps in Switzerland. I've already tuned up the overall photo just to show I've done all this work. And I'm happy here with the overall photo. But this was a beautiful sunrise that morning in the Alps. And the exposure that held detail all through the frame, it didn't darken my sky down enough. The sky became brighter than I think it should have been. So what I'm going to do is open up this control inside of Lightroom Classic. This one's called the graduated filter. In the other type of Lightroom, they call it the gradient tool. And the Photoshop, very similar, calls it the gradient. So what I can do here, this one is a 2-step tool. Step one, I need to tell it where I want the change to happen. Because in this case, I'm not trying to change the whole photo. I'm trying to change this area, not that area. So step one, I'll tell it I want the change to start about here. I'll click and I'll hold down the shift key as I drag, and I'll drag straight down. And where I let go, a second or third line will appear. So just to be clear, this is where I started. And from this line up, the change will happen. Where I let go, from this line and down, no change is going to occur. And this middle pin, this lets me adjust the two. So what I'm creating is a transition zone between change and no change. Well, that sounds fine in theory, but let me show you how it actually works. If I lower the exposure now, and I'm going to overdo this at first, you can see that I've told it to make the top edge of the photo way, way dark. And about here, it begins to fade that darken command to no effect. Well, let's go back to something more reasonable. Let's make the top part of the sky a little bit darker. Let me extend that transition, bring it down just a little. Let's also say bump up a little bit and down a little bit. Let's add a little contrast. Let's use a whole bunch of these controls in here, something like this. And with a little fine tuning, I've probably overdone it. With a little fine tuning, I can go from a sky that looks like this, washed out, almost detailless, to a sky that looks like this. Again, probably too strong, but much more visually interesting. And as a travel landscape photographer, this graduated filter is absolutely one of my favorites. Show you another one. This is what fall looks like here in Montana. I'm really thrilled with the overall image, but the sky in the background is too bright. It's drawing my attention away from the barn and our fall colors. So I'll get my graduated filter. I'll drag out a long transition this time. I'll set the sky a little darker. I might also make it a little bit bluer. I might add a little dehaze. I might add a little contrast. I'm going to overdo this a little for the presentation, but if I turn this on and off, I bet you'll get the idea. Before, after. That's a little overdone, but you get the idea, I hope, that using these tools, I can affect part of my image without affecting the other end. Okay, one last on this. So the place where this gets a little trickier is when you have something like this cliff wall that extends up into the sky. And so here, if I drag out my gradient, my graduated filter, just like I did last time, and I make the sky a whole bunch darker, you can see how that's also affecting the cliff, because the Lightroom here, it doesn't know sky from anything. It just knows that I told it above this line, do everything, below that line, do nothing. So this can be problematic. Well, there is a feature sort of hidden inside here. It's where Lightroom's technology is headed that allows us to modify the work we've done and say, within this area, I want you to exclude part of this photo. And that's what they call the range mask. Now, there are two different types or three different types of range mask. You can tell it, I want you to include only these colors or only these brightnesses. I'm going to go for color for now. When I do that, I get a little eyedropper. And if I hold the shift key, I can select the colors I'm interested in. Let's say this blue and this white and this blue and this purple. And if I click with the Alt key, Alt option on a Mac here, now you'll see kind of a Photoshop diagram where white is the area that we're going to change and black is the area where no change is going to occur. And if I narrow this range down, now I can change that sky, let me just show again, with very little spillover into the cliff wall. And this is very, very handy in scenes like this, or when I have cityscapes and buildings where I want to change part of the photo, but not the whole photo. Let me show you the before. Sky to me is too bright, and after. Again, maybe overdone, but I sure like the way it fits in this frame better now. All right, well, that's the kind of work that we can do to enhance our images using Lightroom. But there's another side to the program, perhaps not as fun, not as active, but as equally important in the organizing of our images. And so the thing, about travel for me is it's all about memorable places. Well, how am I going to find those photos again of my vacation here or there, my adventures, my workshops, years down the road? And this brings us to sort of the organizing strategy in Lightroom. Some people organize one way, some will organize a different way. But there's a feature specifically for travel photographers that I so often think gets overlooked. So far, we've done a tiny bit in Lightroom's library module. That's where we bring our photos in. It's where I would add things like keywords to mark words about what I photographed in that image. We've done a lot in the develop module where we make the photo better, brighter, bluer. But we haven't talked yet about the one specifically to me for travel, and that's the map module. Now, the map, this isn't going to change anything about our photo, but it's the best way to help us organize so we can find these images again down the road. I need to add here, the map is only going to work for you if your computer has an internet connection, because the truth is Adobe is licensing this map from Google, and when you're offline, it can't load Google's mapping database. So for example, here I have a photo from one of the most notable parts. It's actually in Wyoming, but close to Montana, Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. Well, I want to find this photo, let's say 5 years from now. What's going to stick in my memory is where I was, Old Faithful. So I'm going to put this on the map. Now, if your camera has a built-in GPS chip, and if you have that feature active, it would have already been there on the map. That's what Lightroom can do with that GPS data. But I don't have one of those cameras yet, maybe the next one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly the map to Old Faithful. I'll just type it in up here in this little search bar. I'll give Lightroom a second to find that place in Wyoming. And now, since my camera wouldn't do it for me, all I have to do is drag this photo out and drop it on the map. And when I do this, it writes in the GPS coordinates for that location. It will also fill in some of these words, if you let it, for what country, what state, what city, etc. Or here, let's hop back to that, say, Las Vegas photo. If I want to put this Vegas photo on the map, well, obviously Old Faithful is not the right place. So I'll send the map to Las Vegas. In fact, let's say Las Vegas Strip, since that's the right neighborhood. And this guy is down here by the Bellagio. We can see its picture in the corner. I drag, I drop. Once again, it writes the GPS coordinates. And just to show one more, this is the Split Rock Lighthouse on the shore of Lake Superior, up by north of Duluth, Minnesota. Beautiful area of the country. Doesn't get nearly, I think, the publicity it deserves. So to put this one on the map, I'll say Split Rock Lighthouse. And basically, I'm just asking, oh, and I have to say here, spelling counts. Most common locations, Google knows where they are. I drag, I drop. The fact that my camera doesn't have a GPS chip, not a big deal. So Lightroom, it gets these coordinates and it looks it up and says, well, that's the United States, that's Minnesota, that's the city of Silver Bay. And for the sublocation, I can just type in Split Rock Lighthouse. All right, now the point here is that if I put these photos on the map, they'll be easy to find years down the road. And I'll show you a trick with that in just a second. But there is another way of doing this. Since my camera doesn't have a GPS, I often go out and I'll set up my camera and I'll take a picture like this. This is the Bass Harbor Lighthouse in Acadia. Well, while my camera was on the tripod, since my phone has a GPS built into it, the GPS chip, I pulled out my phone, took a picture of my camera. Why? Because this one, if I click here, it knows where it is on the map. So now all I need to do is drag and drop this one on top of that one. And now both of these photos are from the right place geographically. Alternative way of doing this, here's one from the Portland Head Lighthouse, also in Maine. What I could do rather than dragging and dropping it all is I could simply select the photo next to it. Let me show you the real photo, not the one from my camera, but not the one from my phone, but from my big camera. I could select these two photos. I could click the sync button. And I could tell Lightroom, I want to sync those GPS coordinates from the photo I shot with my phone over to the one from my camera that doesn't have a GPS chip. And when I do that, suddenly this one appears right where it should on the map. Easy. Well, this is great for places where my phone works or where it's easy to type in something like the Eiffel Tower, Las Vegas, whatever, on the map. But what if I'm going somewhere way off the grid? For that, I'll show you a set of images here. For this, I went on a month-long raft trip down the Grand Canyon. My phone was totally useless the entire time. And of course, my camera doesn't have a GPS chip yet. So I got one of those GPS communicators. I got a Garmin InReach, a device that can actually track where I go, and it can record that track over the month as a track log. So what I can do here is I can go to the map module. I can click this little button, and I can say to Lightroom, I saved this file from my external GPS unit. I saved this track log, and I want you, Lightroom, to load that path that it recorded in. So I'll send it to my track log. I'll say choose. And what this will do is it'll draw a blue line. Now, I told you this was a long trip. So this is the line where I went on one day as we floated down the Colorado River through Grand Canyon. And if I click here, I'll tell it to load the entire journey, the track I created from the start all the way 200 miles to the finish. Well, with this complete map of where my GPS went, now all I have to do is click here and tell Lightroom, let's see, I want to take from this photo to this photo. I want to tell Lightroom to compare the timestamp on all of these photos to the timestamps on the track log. And since I was careful to set the clock so that they line up, I can tell it to auto tag these 10 photos for me. And just like that, now they appear where they should on the map. In fact, let me zoom in here so you can see just how amazing this is. I'm going to turn the track log off for a second here. Let me turn off the track log. If I go to this spot right here, let me go to this spot right here. These photos were shot just before the Marble Canyon Bridge. These two are right here. Let me show you the photo. That's the photo. And this is where I was in the river when I took that image. The point I'm trying to make here is that whether it's built into our camera, into our phone, whether we drag and drop onto the map, or we use a separate tracking device, we travel photographers can benefit greatly from this feature of Lightroom. Let me zoom out so you can see the whole world, because now when I want to find a photo, I can just click, for example, on this one, and then say, oh, Lightroom, take me to the develop module if I want to enhance this one from Great Smoky. Or if I want, I can go back to the map. I could click on, say, one of these photos. I could say, Lightroom, show me where this photo lives inside my folders, inside all the organizational stuff of Lightroom. And there it is. That the map module is such a wonderful tool. Well, I know I'm running low on time. So to bring this full circle, I want to show you one last feature. The feature here is an organizational tool. It's a filter that gets almost no publicity in the Lightroom world. Now, by filter, I mean we can add info to our photos. We can add keywords. We could add star ratings. We can add all sorts of stuff because that info becomes searchable later. So for example, if I give this photo 5 stars, if I say it's one of my favorites, I can then say to Lightroom years down the road, show me only the 5-star rated stuff. And that photo, of course, pops up because 5 stars matches 5 stars. Well, that's pretty easy to understand. But there's another set of filters that run continuously in the background. And they're what are called smart collections. And basically, what we're doing here is saying to the program, I want you to collect photos for me that meet a certain set of rules. So I'm going to call this one Lighthouses. Now, what I've done before I started this demo is I've added the keyword lighthouse to all of the relevant photos. So what I can do to build this grouping, this smart collection, is simply say, Lightroom, I want you to look for any photo that has the keyword lighthouse. And if I do this, Lightroom will immediately gather up all 9 of the photos that are in here that have that keyword. And if I were to take that keyword away, for example, as soon as it no longer meets the search criteria, it's removed from that grouping. If I put that keyword back, it's added to the grouping. And if I add more photos down the road and I keyword them lighthouse, they'll be added in here too. Well, the part that I really want to like sort of end with is that we can use that geographic stuff and our keywords together. So I can have a lighthouses smart collection grouping. I could also have one called, say, lighthouses of Maine. And this time I need two rules. I need one rule that says keywords contains lighthouse. And then I need another rule that says the location must be the state of Maine. And this time I'm going to set it so that it has to match both of these rules, all of them. And when I do this, out of those 9, 8 of them meet the rules. The one that doesn't, this one from the Split Rock Lighthouse in Michigan. And so for a travel photographer like me, this is really amazing stuff, because rather than having to like put my photos into a folder for Maine, or a folder for lighthouses, or a folder for travel, and a folder for landscape, I can just build these constantly searching smart collections. And as files get added in, they automatically end up where they should. So that if I want to get to work right away on a Lighthouse of Maine calendar or project, I click here and there they are. Well, here, let me start my video back up. Let me stop my screen share because I've completely ignored questions and chat, and I don't want to miss out on the chance to answer some questions.
No, no problem at all, David. Look, on workshops like this, the more learning we get in, the better. So never a problem if you drag it out. And again, I'll invite everybody to get your questions in. I know a lot of times when we're talking about Lightroom, it takes a time to process the information before you even know what you want to ask. And I know with this information, especially with that, like the geotagging stuff, it makes me want to travel and want to have to utilize the benefit of something like that. I've just started doing the keywording. Never realized how I was not utilizing probably the most helpful benefit to Lightroom is just that keywording.
Yeah, the keywording and those smart collections, they go hand in hand. Like I know, Derek, that you have a 4-year-old back there. Setting up a smart collection for your son's name means that for the foreseeable future, every time that you find a photo of him, put his name on it, it automatically gets added into that grouping. And then we could add, say, the star rating, like the best of those photos of him. Give him 5 stars. Now you need 2 rules. Smart collection is your son's name and rating is 5 stars. And there's the best of the photos of your son automatically gathered up for you. Or in my case, the best of my lighthouses, 5 stars, keyword lighthouse. And by working the keyword and some other criteria, Lightroom continually filters and filters and filters, and it does it invisibly and constantly in the background.
I was just going to ask you that if there's any AI that's worked into Lightroom that kind of learns what you shoot, the way you shoot. Does it get easier and less time consuming as you go on?
Well, so I have to be clear in my language here. In this kind of Lightroom Classic, there isn't really a lot of AI on the organizing side, or at least not yet. But the other type of Lightroom, the Adobe Lightroom product where your photos get uploaded to their servers, they have their AI running there so that you can search for things even if you haven't keyworded them. Like you can put in, for example, the word smile, and it will look for all the smiling people in your photos, even if you've never typed that word once as a keyword. You can type in the names of colors, red, blue, green, and it will isolate the photos that are yours on Adobe servers that have the color red. So the technology exists and Adobe is harnessing it, but we don't see a lot of it in the Classic program, at least not yet.
Okay. Now, we'll start it off with the question. Sydney has a question. Do you use specific presets when importing pictures into Lightroom? For example, I've been using preset on import, which do lens corrections on import. Any reason not to do this?
I can't think of any reason not to. I think that's a great time saver. The only thing I would say is that I think I want to be careful. I'll point to myself here on what I include in that preset. If I set one up that just fixes the lens, no problem. But if I set one up that changes the color or the exposure, I can kind of fool myself into believing that all my photos were properly exposed. They weren't. That they were all warmer or more colorful. So I think there are certain settings that do you no harm, but there are other settings. Again, they won't permanently affect your photo, but I think they make it a little harder when we're editing to pick out the overexposed from the underexposed.
Definitely. That makes sense. I mean, especially when what is it? Something that the skew tool, I always is one of those things where it's like, there's different, if you have the one skew tool that kind of looks like an A shape, it works, but then some, it doesn't really do the best job on, depending on the lines in the image. So Sydney, that's something, for example, that I found that I can't bake in into a preset because every image is different. And sometimes it works perfectly. And sometimes you end up with lines that look like a haunted house. Now, Judith is asking, is there a limit to how many collections and smart collections you can have?
There is not. And that's one of the sort of secret benefits of collections and smart collections. There's no limit. And a single photo can be a member of more than one collection, more than one grouping. So like I was sort of demoing, I made a lighthouses, and there were, say, 9 photos in there, and a lighthouses of Maine, and there were 8 photos in there. I could have my favorite lighthouses, and some of those same 9 photos could be in there, and some couldn't. And that's where collections and smart collections are different from the folders that are on our hard drive. A folder can hold one photo, or photos plural. If you want it to be in another folder, we either have to move it, so we got to drag it from place to place, or we got to duplicate it. But if we duplicate it, now we have 2 files. And if you do it again, you have 3 files, and on and on and on. So folders are in some ways far less flexible than collections. And I know this is kind of hard to wrap your head around. So the analogy that I think works for a lot of folks is like our music. If you go to Spotify or whatever streaming service, one song can be in an unlimited number of playlists, right? That the song is part of one album, but that's not all the places we might want to hear it. It might be in my workout playlist, my jogging playlist, my sleepy time music playlist. So it's associated with a number of different collections, but lives in one folder, one album. Albums versus playlists is the way I would describe that.
Definitely. Well, Dave, always a pleasure to have you on. You make it sound so easy. It's like effortless teaching. So I want to thank you again. Remind everybody, check out focusphotoschool.com. If you do have any questions, something you didn't think of, you want to see what Dave has cooking, definitely check that out. Dave, any last words from you?
I just want to say thanks. So far as I know, this is my last broadcast for you guys so far this year. And, despite it sort of being the craziest year, it has been such a pleasure. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Danny. Thanks to all. Thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Definitely. Well, we'll have to re-up in 2022 and get some more Dave Marx on the screen in the virtual event space. But that's it for today. That's it for, like Dave said, this year for Mr. Marx. So we'll get you back soon, Dave.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Have a great fall, everybody, and get out there, shoot some photos before the colors are gone.
I'll leave it there. Well said. Thanks a lot. And everyone have a wonderful evening. Another rendition of B&H Virtual Event Space in the books. Have a good night, everyone.